Everything you should know about G-Men, The Boys spin-off. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Terry and this is Marvelous Videos. Ever since that first season dropped in 2019, The Boys has become Amazon's Game of Thrones in more ways than one. First, it's one of the most authentic adaptations of a comic book series that also veers far off its source material. Second, it's Amazon's most successful intellectual property by far, with a truly global reach. And third, and perhaps most importantly, its success means that they can keep the franchise alive well after the main story is over, thanks to the power of spin-offs.
I can't.
I'm not gonna let you.
Now, admittedly, The Boys is far ahead of the folks over at HBO Max in that regard. They've already pushed out an 8-episode anthology series called The Boys Presents Diabolical, while HBO's Martin-curated world is only now gearing up for its first offshoot in the form of August's House of the Dragon. But it looks like us binge watchers aren't going to have to wait too long for new content to stream the life out of once that show concludes, because Eric Kripke announced a full-length live-action spin-off series called The Boys Varsity in September 2020, and if their filming schedule remains on time, we might get to see the series as early as 2023.
Can they?
And it's set to feature the most lucrative team of supes in the universe, created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, though you haven't heard many overt references to them so far, and perhaps that's for the best. Because in the comics, the G-Men are both the most profitable and most depraved set of supes that Billy's boys come across, and that's saying something. But who are the G-Men? How do they figure into the Kripke-verse? And how different will they be from their comic book counterparts? We're here to tell you all about it. This is everything you should know about The Boys Varsity. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Now, let's begin.
A little more money.
But I can't let you do this.
Then stop.
Godolkin School for Messing Up Supes. Who are the G-Men from The Boys comics? The Boys Varsity is set to be, quote, loosely inspired by the soup team called the G-Men from the comics, and you might have already guessed which kind of superheroes they are a parody of. Yes, X-Men 97 comes out this year, but we want the ultra-crass, ultra-filthy, borderline gladiator-style version, please. Okay, we'll curb our enthusiasm, but you get our point, right? The G-Men, as their name suggests, are a parody of perhaps Marvel's most lucrative piece of IP, the X-Men. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's X-Gene-powered super team debuted in 1963 and has gone on to become one of the most popular superhero franchises in the history of comic books. Basically, the X-Men were Marvel's Avengers before the MCU, in that they were largely responsible for keeping Marvel's mainstream appeal relevant before Kevin Feige reinvented Marvel Studios into the global juggernaut it is today.
Want to hurt you.
In fact, so popular were Xavier's gifted children that it ended up spawning even more sister teams than the Avengers. X-Force, X-Factor, X-Statix, you name it. Charles Xavier's family of mutants have been through all kinds of struggles together, so naturally, Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson decided to take their darker reflections to the extremes that most people would only joke about on online message boards at the time. The G-Men are an exact facsimile of the X-Men in that they ape the mutant super team at every step. The G-Men are counterparts of the X-Men, G-Force is a clear allegory to X-Force, G-Style plays homage to X-Factor, and the teenage team of supes called G-Wiz is basically X-Statix without adult supervision. But, as we mentioned earlier, everything in Ennis's world is meant to be a darker reflection of popular characters and concepts from mainstream comics. And even though the Homelander does Superman Without Morals or the Kents the best out of any Elseworld story, we have to say that the G-Men are perhaps the true embodiment of depravity in the universe of The Boys. Because while the Seven and the rest of the supes contracted by Vought are beasts of their own creation, the G-Men aren't, and somehow their origins are much worse than anything we've covered about the boys on our channel so far. Much like the X-Men, it all starts with the man who brings the team together. But the only way in which John Godolkin is similar to Professor X is in his lofty speech patterns, because the rest of his personality can only be compared with Jimmy Savile, and if that name is ringing warning bells in your head, you might want to skip the next section.
Alright, come on in. You want a soda or something? Not like this can look bad to anyone. I'm not a pedo, by the way. I don't even have fingers.
Vaught's most lucrative IP and John Godolkin's children, G-Men Origins from the comics. The G-Men aren't exactly major players in Garth Ennis's work. In fact, they only appeared for one storyline that ran from issue 23 to 30. Titled We Gotta Go Now, it featured Wee Huey breaking into the G-Men under the guise of bagpipe in order to plant bugs all over Godolkin's mansion and glean any secrets he could off them in the meantime. It would take Butcher's initiative in the end to bring the mission to a satisfactory conclusion, but the things we learned cannot be unlearned, and that's the shame of it all.
But don't you worry. Daddy's home.
In the comics, most supes are contracted by Vought because they are created by Vought. Vought American control every aspect of their creation, from selecting the parents to tailoring their image and finally assisting them with their celebrity lifestyle. That is, except for the G-Men. If you recall, we said that the G-Men were not originally under contract with Vought, and that's because they weren't created by them. They were created by a man called John Godolkin, who managed to get his hands on Compound V and began abducting children from all across America and administering weekly doses to them. That's right, the boys' version of Professor X is basically that guy your mum warns you not to take candy from, and we do mean that quite literally because that's the tactic Godolkin uses to select his children. As you all know by now, Compound V is pretty unstable and can have radically different results in different test subjects, so Godolkin would keep injecting his with weekly doses until they manifested as superpower. This is actually quite similar to what Stormfront and Stan Edgar were doing with the Sage Grove Center in Amazon's The Boys, where they were using the Mental Institute's patients as guinea pigs for Compound V experimentation.
You could be a danger to yourself.
Well, I'm not doing any more of these stupid pet tricks until I talk to my sister.
But the big difference is that Godolkin's subjects were literal children, often ranging between the ages of 6 to 10, and that their doses weren't given to them as part of an experiment. It was part of a bigger master plan that would see him become one of the richest people on planet Earth. Once Godolkin had achieved stable results for 6 of his children, he banded them together and bound them to his will, giving them exactly one creed to live by, and that was to protect the G-Men's secrets at all costs. He sent a letter to Vought in 1984 with a unique money-making proposition that ended up making a fortune for all parties involved. Godolkin suggested that he would give Vought the rights to market and make profit off of his G-Men so long as he was allowed to operate outside of their sphere of influence. His marketing proposition was a smash hit with consumers. Branding his team as a ragtag bunch of orphans, misfits and runaways, Godolkin had essentially struck entertainment gold, as the success of his team's commercial ventures allowed him to create half a dozen sister teams, bringing nearly 80 supes under his direct command. In fact, it was revealed that after the 7, the G-Men were the most successful Vought franchise, with their comic book sales alone racking up $1 billion in revenue annually. Given that they were such a hit with the people, Vought decided it would be better to accommodate Godolkin rather than alienate him, which would turn out to be a disaster for them in the timeline of The Boys because, as we've already stated, he was basically Garth Ennis's version of Jimmy Savile as well. And if you really don't know who that is, Google him. You'll get why we aren't going too deep into this stuff. Suffice it to say, the father of the G-Men used his, inclinations and a good old bit of brainwashing to make his children forget everything about their lives before he kidnapped them and turned them into his personal playthings and bodyguards. Over time, he even invited top officials from Vought to join in on his depravity, which was probably the start of his downfall because it alerted Vought American to the possibility of John's secrets being exposed to the general public, and the one thing they didn't take lightly was a PR nightmare. And believe you me, if there was ever a walking, talking PR nightmare, it was John Godolkin. And so he was always kept under surveillance in case contingencies needed to be put into place, and Butcher's Boys proved all of that and more.
Oh, shit, kid, are you okay?
What happened in The Boys issue 23 to 30? We gotta go now. So, the very reason that the boys got onto the case of the G-Men was because Silver Kincaid, the in-universe parody of Jean Grey from the X-Men, ended up committing suicide in a city with no random connection to her official backstory, talking about an Uncle Paul that she never officially had. This sparks Susan Rayner to turn to Billy Butcher and his team, though Butcher is always one step ahead of his raunchy deputy director and knows why she's really turning to him. Rayner must already have an in to the G-Men, and she needs Billy to do the muscle work for her. And it turns out he was right, because by the end of the story, it was revealed that Silver Kincaid had agreed to become a confidential informant for the CIA, but she ended up killing herself before anything could come of it. Butcher stole all this data and more from Monkey and decided that he was going to send in his best man to scope the G-Men out. That man would be Bagpipe, aka Wee Huey, in the most outrageous suit costume this side of Polka Dot Man. Huey's mission is simple. He's supposed to infiltrate G-Wiz and plant bugs all over Godolkin's mansion to gather intel on the man and anything that could give the boys a leverage against him. Of course, Butcher would prefer to just straight up exterminate everyone from the G-Men, but he's playing ball with Rayner for now. Huey ends up going to the G-Wiz house, which is more like a frat house than anything else, but he does notice something peculiar. The G-Wiz kids weren't like the rest of the Supes. In fact, they were actually kind of nice, if not grossly inappropriate and lacking any concept of boundaries. The G-Wiz kids actually thought of each other as family and shared a genuine bond with each other, which sucked because they were all destined to break up and move into one of the G-teams post-graduation. But this was the first hint that there was something seriously wrong with the way the G-Men operated. Of course, you guys know what that was because we've already addressed it, but at this point in the comics it's left pretty vague. In fact, nowhere is John Godolkin's sexual preference mentioned in the comics, but the nods to his heinous choices are more than enough to leave us thoroughly disturbed. Suffice to say, every member of the G-Team has faced it, except Huey of course because he's from the outside. And that's perhaps his biggest mistake, because when Huey gets invited to the G-Men mansion for Silver Kincaid's funeral service, he lets slip the fact that he knows more than he should, which tips off Godolkin to his true purpose. He immediately contacts Vought about it, and sure enough, his status as a spy comes to light rather quickly thanks to James Stillwell. But he isn't exactly trying to help out Godolkin here, because as we've already mentioned, Godolkin is a time bomb waiting to explode at the first expose, and as of late, he's been pushing his hand a bit too much. First off, Silver Kincaid wasn't the only member of the G-Men to kill herself after realizing just what Godolkin had done to her, which was revealed by an excellent subplot that followed Mother's Milk meticulously investigating her real identity. The other person to check herself into an early grave was Nubia, but she was resurrected by Godolkin and now existed in a near vegetative state, only asking people to kill her and put her out of her misery. Vought was understandably horrified by this, but Godolkin insisted that he needed her on the team because she was, quote, his child. They allowed it to happen the first time around, but when Silver Kincaid died, they took no chances and immediately cleaned up the scene. Secondly, Godolkin's control over his Supes was ironclad, but their actions threatened to expose them anyway. For example, the G-Coast and G-Style teams were locked in an eternal feud over the death of someone called Too Cool, and their petty feud had blown up so much that they couldn't be put in the same room together without the threat of either of them killing the other. In truth, this entire feud is meant to satirize the 90s West Coast-East Coast feud in the hip-hop community, with Too Cool probably being Garth Ennis's ode to Tupac Shakur. But if you were alive during that era, and I was, you can probably understand why this was an issue. The deaths of Tupac and the Notorious B.I.G. put a firm spotlight on gang culture in America and the violence that surrounded it. Perhaps even more so because the two bona fide celebrities had affiliations to major criminal organizations, which gave the entire music industry a bad name at the time, with gangster rap being labeled a menace to society in the 90s. Parlay that media coverage into the universe of the boys within the context of the formation of the G-Men, and you can see how this petty feud can end up exposing one of the many dirty secrets Vought has been hiding from the public about their founder. The last out-of-line act that Godolkin committed, which basically sealed his fate with Vought, was trying to create a team of toddler Supes that he dubbed Pre-Wiz. This is not something new either, as Godolkin had asked Vought for permission to create the Pre-Wiz before and was denied on rather obvious grounds. But Godolkin ignored Vought and went on with their creation anyway. Their public revelation would have meant the end for Vought because they were keenly aware of Godolkin's tastes, and the fact that his brainwashing took time to take hold of its target permanently, and even then it wasn't a guarantee. To thrust the Pre-Wiz into the spotlight would spell inevitable doom for their company, regardless of the immense amount of money the G-teams brought in for them. And so James Stillwell made the executive decision to preemptively take care of his problem. When Huey inevitably screwed up the mission and got burnt as a result, because he just can't stop his savior complex from taking over in the comics, the boys geared up to take down all of Godolkin's children, and we do mean all, because every G-team was assembled to take out Butcher's boys. But before they could even make a move, covert Red River operatives flooded the front lawn of Godolkin's mansion, and in a shocking betrayal opened fire on all of them. Not a single G-man survived that day, and even Billy was taken aback by the rank ruthlessness of the act. Not that he didn't approve. For him, that was 80 less Supes to think of, but he couldn't help but think why Vought would do this, to which the VA executive in charge of the operation replies, "We can clean up our own messes too," or something to that effect. And with that, the world's second most famous Supe team was extinguished in a single night by the very hand that financed their popularity, which just goes to show the levels Vought is willing to stoop to in order to protect their own interests. But all of this takes place in the comics, which is a decidedly darker world than the one Eric Kripke has created for Amazon Prime's video subscribers. Because by his own admission, The Boys Varsity is only, quote, loosely inspired by the G-Men, and we're going to take him at his word because some of the stuff that the G-Men were subjected to is too traumatizing to commit to film. Yes, even for a TV series with exploding orifices and scattered body parts galore. But how is he bringing in this Supe team to his expanded live-action universe? Well, he's taking it all back to college, quite literally.
I am so sorry. Are you...
The Boys Varsity. How Amazon's The Boys franchise sets up the college-themed spin-off. If you want to get pedantic about things, then The Boys has technically been setting this spin-off series from the first episode. If you recall the scene between Madeline Stillwell and the mayor of Baltimore, they were discussing the transfer of Nubian Prince from Detroit to the mayor's city for a hefty contract, no less. Now, Nubian Prince is a show-exclusive character and is basically the Boys' version of Black Panther, but the more interesting thing about him is his personal life. Because, as revealed in The Boys Presents Diabolical's 6th episode, also one of the 3 canon episodes from the series, Nubian Prince was married to and had a child with Nubia, who, as we've already mentioned, was a major part of the G-Men storyline in the comics. As for the first overt reference to the G-Men, that would come as an Easter egg during a Season 2 news update that points out the G2 movement. This is significant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's the first official reference to the G-Men team in Amazon's The Boys, and secondly, it means that the spin-off will address the whole John Godolkin character in a more, shall we say, contemporary setting. Because we know that he is a vicious sexual predator in the comics, but his target of choice, so to speak, is not something any showrunner would even think of bringing up in one of their creations. So instead it looks like Eric Kripke and co decided to take the real world route and intertwine that aspect of the G-Men's comic origins with the Me Too movement, hinting that predatory behavior will be addressed in the series as well, just not how comic book fans might have expected it. In fact, Amazon said as much in their official press release regarding the show, stating that it would explore the lives and consequences of the actions of teenage Supes in Godolkin University in a rather more realistic college setting. That's one of the biggest things to look forward to with this series because all 3 main executive producers, Eric Kripke, Seth Rogen, and Evan Goldberg, have expressed a desire to make The Boys Varsity as realistic a portrayal of college life as possible. And that includes all of the American Pie scenarios and a whole lot more. They also said that it would involve a Hunger Games style televised deathmatch, so we'll see how realistic it ends up being overall. But the one thing we can't dispute about any of their claims is the fact that they have already started setting this spin-off up with some serious Easter eggs being sprinkled all across their promotional and actual storyline material.
This is some tough stuff, I know. But when you gave him to the Russians, you knew Soldier Boy would come back one day.
The first time the Godolkin University is name-dropped is in the excellent Fox News parody web series called 7 on 7 with Cameron Coleman, which you guys should definitely check out on the Vought International YouTube channel. The January 2022 update saw Coleman bring up Godolkin University in reference to Vaught's annual hero draft, which is their name for the Hunger Games-esque deathmatch we're assuming, and rave about the lucrative contracts that await its young Supes. We find out that A-Train and the Deep are both graduates of the university and were drafted by New York and the Seven. So was Queen Maeve, who also revealed to us through the TV show that Homelander was her batchmate, which could actually lead to a spin-off story based entirely on their time together in GU, but we're less optimistic about that. What we are optimistic about is Patrick Schwarzenegger joining the cast of the Extended Boys universe as Golden Boy, the top prospect from GU, and the person earmarked to win the hero draft this time around. It'll be very interesting to see Arnie's son navigate his way through the R-rated minefield that can be The Boys, and just to see his portrayal of the literal golden boy trope in general go off the rails, as things are wont to do in this universe. This news update was followed by a slew of character cameos and Easter eggs, all of which happened in the first 3 episodes of Season 3. We got to see the show's version of Silver Kincaid, who's a Muslim from England and very much alive. Nubia, who was dropped from the American Hero finals, presumably because Homelander didn't want her. Cold Snap, Stacker and Airburst were all rounded up by Victoria Newman's Federal Bureau of Superhero Affairs, and Europa was referenced on Mother's Milk's investigation board in the first couple of episodes. Finally, when Huey visits the Red River Institute, an orphanage for the super-abled in the series as opposed to being a rip-off of Blackwater, we see him scroll past a list of names which also includes a girl named Marie M, who is portrayed by Jazz Sinclair, one of the confirmed cast members of The Boys' Varsity. Red River doesn't have a huge role in the comics. They serve as the private military wing of Vought and are generally only called in for cleanup ops and the occasional liaison with the American military. But the TV show has already made this obscure outfit way more integral to the story by not only turning it into a soup orphanage, but also making it the origin point for several enigmatic characters from The Boys. We've mentioned Jazz Sinclair's upcoming character, but we can't forget our favourite head-popping Red River alum, Victoria Newman, aka Nadia, and possibly the world's next fastest man alive in the form of Teddy Stillwell, the infant son of Madeline Stillwell. So it looks like instead of being sent in to exterminate the G-Men, Red River will actually act as a feeder system for the team, which reverses their comic book dynamic in a rather intriguing fashion. But that's all we can say about the way in which The Boys sets up its college-based spin-off. As for when it comes out, The Boys' Varsity might come out as early as the first quarter of 2023. This might make fans of the comics and the TV show skeptical because it took the original series a whole decade before even getting off the ground properly. But Amazon, much like Vought International, was happy to fast-track their most lucrative property into diversification when they announced the spin-off series 2 seasons into the original show, thanks to the latter's wild success. The Boys' Varsity began filming earlier this year at the University of Toronto and is on track to wrap up shooting by October 2022. If they stay on schedule, we could get the series as early as the first half of 2023, with a trailer drop at the end of Season 3 being a likely possibility. As for an official release date though, Amazon remains tight-lipped, which makes sense honestly because it took them 2 years to get the first season out, and then Season 3 got delayed thanks to COVID-19, so who knows what might happen when. But all this is to say that the series might just come out sooner than you think it will. Early to mid-2023 would be our guess, but don't blame us if Amazon decides Season 4 of The Boys is more of a priority and push Varsity back to late 2023 or early 2024. Regardless, we should have an update pretty soon. Marvelous verdict. At first, when we heard about the G-Men spin-off, we were concerned because we knew the source material and rendering a faithful adaptation of half the stuff the boys do in the comics would land the entire production team in jail. But then we realised we don't need to worry about how accurate the show was going to be, so long as it maintained the core principles and facets of the G-Men storyline. Now, admittedly, there is already very less scope of that given that Eric Kripke has said no major characters from the boys will spin off into Varsity, and the We Gotta Go Now storyline basically featured the whole gang plus Terra. But the fact that the G2 movement is a thing gives us hope that the biggest issues surrounding the G-Men will still be addressed. It'll also be very interesting to see who lands the role of John Godolkin himself, purely because he is one of the purest villains in the Boys universe, even by Vought standards. I mean, James Stillwell directly moved to exterminate him and all his teams, something he didn't do when he found pictures of Homelander eating babies and messing with dead bodies on his desk. So, whoever lands that role has to be a particularly preachy type of greaseball aristocrat, and we can't wait to see who it'll be. Regardless to say, the hype is very much real for the Boys' Varsity. If Amazon plays their cards right, it can be the new High School Musical for an entire generation of children, except it'll be much less pleasant, much more sexual, and far too gratuitous in its violence, and we can't wait to see it all. If you enjoyed watching this video, then please hit that like button. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to stay updated about all the content we upload. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Sorry about that, kid. Not really good at doorknobs.